Lyra stepped into the grand hall, her heartbeat thundering in her chest. The room was alive with glittering gowns and painted smiles, but all she could feel was the weight of her past. An exile from the wild lands of the north, standing in a world of silk and lies. The whispers followed her like a pack of wolves, eyes flicking to the marks on her face, the scars of battles fought and lost. She wanted nothing more than to be back in the cold embrace of the mountains, where the ground smelled of pine and blood, not jasmine and deceit. "You're nothing but a beast," a voice hissed. Lyra's fists clenched, but she stood tall. Her father's words echoed in her mind. A true warrior does not show anger in the face of insult. The Duke's gaze locked on hers from across the room, his smile cold as steel. His ambition was as clear as the scent of danger in the air. She'd grown up hearing stories of his house's rivalry with hers, but tonight, the stakes were higher than bloodlines. Tonight, the choosing ceremony would decide her fate. A deep breath. She would survive this. She had to. Lyra's eyes swept over the crowd of polished nobility, their laughter as false as the jewels they wore. She kept her head high, pretending not to notice the sneers, the whispers that followed her every step. But as she reached the far side of the hall, her gaze caught on a figure standing alone in the shadows, far from the nobles vying for attention. He wore simple leather armor, worn and faded from battle. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, hard and unreadable. There was no mistaking it. He didn't belong here any more than she did. His presence felt like a storm on the horizon, a tension that tugged at the very air. For a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no pity in his gaze, no mockery. Just a quiet understanding, as if he saw her for what she truly was. Lyra moved toward him instinctively, drawn by the pull of something she couldn't explain. She passed by all the faces that only saw her scars, and for the first time tonight, she felt something other than shame. The man stood still as she approached, the shadows clinging to him like a second skin. "I didn't think I'd find someone like you here," he said, his voice low and rough, almost a growl. "What's your name?" "Lyra," she replied, her voice steady. "And you?" "Kaelin." His gaze flicked over her with a quiet intensity, as if trying to read her soul. "You don't belong here," he said, his words so blunt they cut through the suffocating formality of the event. "And where do I belong?" she asked, challenging him with her eyes. "Somewhere where your scars are a mark of strength, not shame." The weight of his words settled deep in her chest. They both knew this was no place for a warrior like her. But Kaelin didn't look at her like a mistake. He saw her, truly saw her. And it was the first time in her life someone hadn't judged her for the marks left by her past. The ceremony dragged on, but Lyra's mind was far from the pomp and pretense of the noble gathering. Her heart beat erratically in her chest as the Lord Regent called for the start of the choosing. The moon goddess's blessing was to be invoked, a bond forged between pacts, a union of power. For most of the room, it was a night of anticipation. For Lyra, it was a cruel reminder of how far she had fallen. She'd never been part of this world, and tonight, the truth was clearer than ever. There was nothing in her that could make her fit among these people. They had money, they had beauty, they had power. But she had nothing but the weight of her family's legacy, her scars, and a warrior's pride. As the crowd hushed, her father's voice boomed from across the room. He stood with his hand raised, a silent command for her to come forward. She stiffened, forced herself to move, and walked toward the center of the hall, her every step feeling heavier than the last. The Lord Regent smiled in that all-too-pleasing way, a wolf in sheep's clothing. "Let us begin," he said, as a line of suitors approached, eager to make their claim on her, their eyes filled with false promises and calculated smiles. One by one they bowed. Their words were laced with honeyed flattery, their hands too eager as they reached for her. But Lyra didn't flinch. She stood tall, her mind already made up. "I refuse," she declared, her voice firm, cutting through the silence like a sword. The room froze, every eye trained on her. The murmurs started, then grew into a chorus of disbelief. The Lord Regent's smile faltered, but she didn't care. She wasn't going to play the game. It was then that she saw him, Kaelin, standing off to the side, watching her. The intensity in his gaze never wavered, as if he was waiting for something. She felt a fire stir within her, something more than the defiance that had driven her so far. This was different. "I choose him," she said, her voice ringing out, steady and strong. The hall fell into stunned silence. All eyes turned to Kaelin, the man who had stood in the shadows. He didn't belong here. He was an outsider. But for her, that was enough. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, the quiet in his gaze speaking volumes. Lyra's pulse quickened. This was madness. She knew it. But at that moment, she didn't care. She was done pretending. She was done being a pawn in their game. The air was thick with tension as Lyra stood before Kaelin, her choice ringing in her ears like a battle cry. The whispers in the room grew louder, sharper, like daggers thrown from every corner. She could hear the murmurs of shock, the stifled gasps of disbelief, but it didn't matter. In that moment, it was just her and him, Kaelin, the man who had seen her without judgment. But the consequences of her defiance came swiftly. The Lord Regent's smile had turned to a hard line. He stepped forward, his voice thick with barely contained fury. "You choose a man who is not of your rank," he said, his words dripping with venom. "You choose a man who has no title, no land, no honor." "I choose him," Lyra repeated, her voice unwavering. She wasn't ashamed of her decision. Her choice was her own, and no one, least of all the Lord Regent, would take that from her. Kaelin's eyes flickered with something that might have been approval, but it was gone before she could be sure. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence was enough to show that he wasn't playing by anyone else's rules. The Lord Regent, however, was far from pleased. He turned away with a disgusted grunt, his gaze shifting to the other men in the room, each one a wolf in a different skin. "We'll see about this," he muttered, his words low but cutting. "You may have chosen your man, Lyra of the Northern Ridge, but the consequences of this foolishness will be dire." Her heart thundered in her chest, but she didn't flinch. She had made her choice, and she would stand by it, no matter the cost. Kaelin, however, seemed unmoved by the threat. His eyes were cold, distant, as if this was just another battle in a war he had long since accepted. Suddenly, the doors to the hall slammed open, and a group of guards entered, their armor gleaming under the chandeliers. Lyra stiffened, her hand instinctively going to the hilt of her sword. The tension in the room escalated. The captain of the guard stepped forward, his voice sharp and commanding. "By the order of the Alpha King, the Lady Lyra of the Northern Ridge is to be taken into custody." The crowd gasped in shock. "What is this?" Lyra demanded, her voice rising with anger. "The Alpha King has decreed that your family is a threat to the throne," the captain said, his eyes cold. "You and your house are under suspicion of treason." The words hit her like a blow to the chest. Treason. Her father's legacy, her home. All at risk because of the choice she had made in that hall. Kaelin stepped forward, his presence imposing, his voice low and controlled. "She has done nothing wrong," he growled. "The treason lies with those who seek to tear this house down." The captain's eyes flicked to Kaelin, his expression betraying a flicker of recognition. "And you?" he asked, his voice colder now. "Who are you to speak on behalf of the lady?" Lyra stood tall, stepping between Kaelin and the captain. "You may take me," she said, her voice firm, "but you will not take my father or my house. You will not break me." The guards hesitated, their weapons ready but uncertain. The room held its breath, the tension so thick it was almost unbearable. The silence stretched on until the captain gave a sharp nod, signaling the guards to step back. "Then we have no choice but to wait for the Alpha King's judgment," the captain said coldly, before turning on his heel and marching out of the hall. The crowd slowly began to disperse, the whispers continuing, now tinged with fear and uncertainty. Lyra felt her heart race. The fight was just beginning. Kaelin turned to her, his gaze steady. "It seems we have more to worry about than just ceremony," he said quietly. The hall emptied slowly, the glittering guests dispersing like leaves caught in a winter wind, leaving only the weight of what had just transpired between Lyra and Kaelin. The sounds of the crowd faded into the distance, leaving a deafening silence in their wake. Lyra's pulse raced, but she stood her ground, her back straight and her heart heavy with the gravity of the moment. Kaelin didn't speak at first, his gaze fixed on the empty space where the Duke had stood moments before. He was a man of few words, but every one of his silences felt like an unspoken vow. Lyra could feel the weight of his presence beside her, like a shadow that refused to leave. "They'll come for us," she said, her voice low and steady. "The Regent won't just let this go." Kaelin turned to her, his golden eyes gleaming with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. "I've seen worse," he said, his voice a low growl. "But I'll protect you. No one will take you from me." His words were a promise, and something deep inside Lyra stirred in response. The walls she had spent so long building around herself began to crumble, piece by piece. She had always been alone, had always fought for everything she had. But now, standing beside Kaelin, there was a flicker of something she hadn't dared to hope for. "Why help me?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion and curiosity. "You don't owe me anything." Kaelin's gaze softened for the briefest of moments, and it was enough to make Lyra's heart skip. "Because you're not alone anymore," he said quietly. "And I never walk away from a fight I believe in." Before Lyra could respond, the doors to the hall burst open again, and the Lord Regent's voice rang out across the chamber, cold and commanding. "Lyra of the Northern Ridge, by the authority of the Alpha King, you are to be taken into custody for questioning regarding your allegiance. Surrender now, or face the consequences." The air thickened with tension, and Lyra's grip tightened on the hilt of her sword. This wasn't just a matter of ceremony anymore. Her family was at risk. The life she had known was about to be ripped apart by the very men who had sworn to protect it. Kaelin stepped forward, his form blocking her path as he met the Lord Regent's gaze with a cool, unwavering stare. "She won't surrender," he said, his voice filled with quiet menace. "And neither will I." The Regent's eyes flickered to Kaelin, recognition slowly dawning in his eyes. "And who are you?" the Regent asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. Kaelin smiled, though it was more a baring of teeth than anything remotely friendly. "I'm the one who's going to make sure you regret that question." The tension in the room cracked like thunder. Lyra's heart pounded as she watched Kaelin, unsure of what he was capable of, but trusting in the strange connection that had already begun to form between them. Before the Regent could respond, a sharp sound broke through the thick atmosphere. A horn, distant but growing louder. Lyra's eyes widened. It was the horn of the royal guard. The gates were already closing. The walls of the palace were about to become her prison, and if she didn't act now, she'd lose her chance. "Move," Kaelin ordered quietly, his voice full of command. Lyra didn't hesitate. They were on the run, no longer pawns in someone else's game, but players in their own. Her instincts kicked in, and she followed Kaelin through the back halls, the echoes of their footsteps growing louder as they neared the exit. Her world, which had been built on the delicate balance of diplomacy and power, was now collapsing around her, and for the first time in her life, she didn't care. She was ready to fight, and with Kaelin beside her, she was ready to win. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale, silver glow over the city as Lyra and Kaelin slipped through the shadows. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by the wet earth beneath them, but the world around them felt like it was closing in. Every step they took was one closer to the unknown, but for the first time, Lyra didn't feel fear. She felt something else, freedom. They moved swiftly through the alleyways, the streets eerily quiet as the city seemed to hold its breath. Lyra's mind raced, her thoughts flickering between the chaos they had left behind and the uncertain future that lay ahead. The Duke's forces would be on high alert, and the royal guard would be hunting them down. If they were caught, the consequences would be severe. But there was something in Kaelin's presence that steadied her. His movements were calm, precise, as if he had walked through the storm of danger 100 times before. She could feel the weight of his decisions pressing on him, and though he said little, his silence spoke volumes. He was a king who had lost everything, and now he was fighting for something far greater than a throne. They reached the edge of the city, where the darkness of the forest stretched before them like an endless ocean. The trees whispered in the wind, their branches swaying in a rhythm that spoke of ancient secrets and untold dangers. Lyra could feel the weight of the wilderness, but she wasn't afraid. This was her home, the place where she had been born and raised. The land of her ancestors was wild and unforgiving, but it was hers. "We can't stay in the city," Kaelin said, his voice low as he scanned the treeline. "It's only a matter of time before they send reinforcements. We need to get to the mountains, your clan's fortress, Ridgefall. If we can make it there, we can regroup." Lyra nodded, her heart a mix of dread and determination. Ridgefall was her family's home, the seat of power in the north. It was a place of strength, of honor, but it was also a place that could be torn apart by the same treachery that had already reached their doorstep. "We'll make it," she said, her voice steady. "We'll fight. We won't let them take everything." Kaelin's gaze softened, just for a moment. "I believe you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. They didn't need to say anything more. Lyra knew that Kaelin, for all his power, was as much a prisoner of fate as she was. They were both running from the consequences of their choices, from the lies that had trapped them, and toward the only thing that could save them: the truth. As they stepped into the wilderness, the sounds of the city faded, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of wolves. Lyra felt her heartbeat slow, her senses sharpening as the familiar scent of pine and earth filled her lungs. This was where she was meant to be. This was where she could fight. They moved deeper into the forest, the shadows of the trees becoming their only shelter. Kalen led the way, his sharp eyes scanning the path ahead, while Lyra followed, her sword at the ready. She had always known how to survive in the wild, how to navigate the rugged terrain, and now, that knowledge would serve her in ways she had never imagined. The moonlight flickered through the canopy, casting their shadows in strange, shifting patterns on the ground. There was a quiet stillness around them, but Lyra could feel the danger creeping closer. Every sound in the forest felt like it could be an enemy, every rustle in the leaves a threat. Suddenly, Kalen stopped, his hand lifting in a signal for her to be silent. Lyra's body went still, her senses on high alert as she scanned the area around them. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Movement," Kalen replied, his voice low. "We're not alone." The silence that followed Kalen's words felt thick, like the air before a storm. Lyra's senses were heightened, every muscle in her body tensed and ready to react. She strained her ears, listening for any sound that didn't belong, any indication of movement in the dense woods around them. Kalen shifted slightly, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, but his eyes remained locked on the shadows ahead. Lyra followed his gaze, scanning the trees, the underbrush, the faint flicker of moonlight filtering through the canopy. There was something out there. She could feel it, the same way she could sense the changing of the seasons, the shift in the wind. A twig snapped somewhere to their left, followed by the rustling of leaves. Lyra's heart skipped a beat, but Kalen's gaze remained steady. He turned slightly, moving into the shadows, pulling her along with him. She didn't ask questions. His instincts were sharp, and she trusted them, trusted him. They crouched low, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. The rustling sound grew louder, and Lyra's pulse quickened. Whoever, or whatever, it was close. Too close. Kalen motioned for her to stay still, and Lyra nodded, her breath shallow as she tried to steady herself. The sound came again, louder this time, a steady crunching of leaves and twigs underfoot. The footsteps were slow but deliberate, as if the person, or predator, was stalking them, deliberately making their presence known. Lyra's hand rested on her sword, the hilt cool against her palm, but she knew there was no time to make a move unless absolutely necessary. Kalen had already given the signal. They would wait, watch, and assess. The footsteps drew closer. A shadow moved through the trees, tall and imposing, casting a long silhouette in the moonlight. For a moment, everything went still. The figure paused, as if sensing their presence, and Lyra held her breath, trying to make herself as small as possible. Then, with a low, guttural growl, the figure stepped forward. It was a man, barely, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark, his face rugged and scarred, with a deep snarl twisted across his lips. His clothes were torn, his hands gripped tightly around a battle axe, and his gait was predatory, the steps of someone who had hunted before and was now the hunter. "How long do you think you can hide, Lyra of the North?" The man's voice rumbled, low and menacing. He stepped closer, his gaze narrowing in the direction they were hiding. "I've been sent to find you." Lyra's heart pounded as her thoughts raced. This wasn't just a random wanderer. He was one of the royal guards, a tracker. They were closing in on them faster than she'd anticipated. Kalen shifted beside her, his muscles coiled like a spring, but still he made no move. He was assessing, waiting for the right moment to strike. The man's snarl deepened. "Your little rebellion ends here," he spat, his voice harsh with contempt. "The Alpha King's orders are clear. Surrender or face the consequences." Lyra's instincts flared. She could feel the air shift, the wildness of the forest becoming more than just a backdrop. It was now a part of her, responding to her energy. She felt the pull of the wolf beneath her skin, the familiar ache of the beast that had been a constant companion throughout her life. The man was no mere threat. He was a challenge, one she had no intention of losing. "Is that a threat?" Lyra's voice rang out from the shadows, calm but laced with a quiet fury. She stepped forward, her sword drawn and ready, her eyes locked on the hunter who dared to hunt her. Kalen stepped with her, moving like a shadow, his form a dark blur in the night. Together, they stood their ground, facing the man who had come to end them. The hunter took a step back, his eyes widening as Kalen emerged from the darkness beside Lyra. The glow in his eyes shifted, as if recognizing something more than just a lone woman with a sword. "You're a fool," the man snarled, his grip tightening around his axe. "Do you think you can fight us all?" Kalen's voice was cold, his tone smooth and lethal. "I don't need to fight them all. Just you." The man lunged, the axe raised above his head, but Kalen moved faster than Lyra could blink. The sound of steel clashing against steel rang through the air as he met the attack with practiced ease, his sword a blur of deadly precision. Lyra didn't wait. She moved, her instincts taking over as she joined the fight. Her blade sliced through the air, meeting the hunter's side with a force that sent him stumbling back. The man howled in pain, his stance faltering as the blood began to stain his shirt. Kalen's golden eyes locked with hers, his silent command clear. "Finish him." Lyra didn't hesitate. She closed the distance between them in a heartbeat, her sword a flash of steel as it drove into the man's chest, cutting through the armor and flesh with a sickening crunch. The hunter's body crumpled to the ground, lifeless, before he even hit the dirt. The silence that followed was deafening. The forest, once alive with the sounds of pursuit, was now eerily still. Lyra stood over the fallen man, her chest heaving, the adrenaline pumping through her veins. Her gaze flicked to Kalen, who was already wiping his sword clean, his expression unreadable. "Is that how it will always be now?" she asked, her voice quieter now, the tension starting to melt away. Kalen's gaze softened, just a fraction. "It won't be easy," he replied, "but I'll be with you, every step of the way." Lyra nodded, a silent promise passing between them. They were far from safe, and the road ahead was dangerous. But in that moment, it didn't matter. They had each other, and that was enough. The night stretched on, the moon now a cold, distant witness to the chaos they had left behind. Lyra's thoughts were a tangled mess, but there was one thing that remained clear. The road ahead was treacherous, and it had just begun. Kalen didn't speak as they moved deeper into the wilderness, the path now more treacherous than ever. The forest was thick with underbrush and twisting roots, the shadows wrapping around them like a cloak. The distant sound of wolves howling echoed through the trees, a reminder that they weren't alone. But it wasn't the wolves that concerned her. It was the men who would follow them, royal guards, assassins, the Duke's spies. She knew they couldn't outrun them forever. "We need to keep moving," Kalen said, his voice low but commanding. "We'll rest when we're out of their reach." Lyra nodded, though her body screamed for rest. The fight with the hunter had left her exhausted, but she couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. They had to reach the borderlands. Her people needed to know the truth. They needed to be prepared for what was coming. They pushed on through the dense forest, moving in silence. Every crack of a twig, every rustle in the bushes made her tense, her eyes darting to the shadows, searching for any sign of movement. But as the night wore on, her exhaustion began to catch up with her. Her limbs were heavy, and her mind was foggy with fatigue. A few hours later, they reached the edge of the forest, where the trees opened up to reveal a vast expanse of rocky terrain. The mountains loomed in the distance, their jagged peaks like the teeth of some ancient creature waiting to devour them. It was a place she knew well, the land of her ancestors. But even here, in the wild heart of the north, there was no safety. Not anymore. Kalen turned to her, his face etched with determination. "We'll rest here. At least for a few hours," he said, his voice softer now, as though the weight of their journey was starting to settle on him too. Lyra glanced around, taking in their surroundings. The wind was picking up, and the air was thick with the scent of rain. She didn't feel safe here, not yet. But Kalen was right. They needed to gather their strength. They set up a small camp in the shelter of a rock outcrop, the dark sky above them heavy with the promise of a storm. Lyra sat by the fire, her hands trembling slightly as she stared into the flames, lost in thought. Kalen, ever watchful, sat across from her, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Do you ever wonder if it was all worth it?" she asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was barely above a whisper, as if the question itself was a fragile thing she didn't want to break. Kalen didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her with those golden eyes of his, as though weighing her question carefully. "Worth it," he repeated, his voice low. "Every choice we make has consequences. We both knew what we were walking into." Lyra's heart clenched at the truth in his words. She had chosen this path, had chosen to defy the nobles, the duke, and everything she had ever known. And now, everything was unraveling. Her family was at risk, her home under siege, and the man who had been a stranger just hours ago was now her only ally in a world that seemed determined to destroy them both. "I don't know anymore," she whispered. "I wanted to protect my people, to stand for something real, but now it feels like I've only made things worse." Kaelin's gaze softened, a flicker of something deep in his eyes, something raw, something real. "You're stronger than you know," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he didn't try to hide. "You made the only choice you could, and you'll keep making those choices because that's who you are." Lyra's chest tightened, and she could feel her heart beating faster. She had never allowed herself to lean on anyone before. But Kaelin, he made her believe that maybe, just maybe, they could survive this together. The wind howled through the cracks in the rocks, sending a chill through the air. Lyra pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders, the cold creeping into her bones. But she didn't care. Not now. Not with Kaelin by her side. He rose to his feet suddenly, his sharp eyes scanning the distance. "We've got company," he muttered, his hand going to the sword at his side. Lyra's heart skipped a beat, and she immediately sprang to her feet, her senses alert. "How many?" "Too many," Kaelin said, his voice dark. "And they're closing in fast." Lyra's pulse quickened as Kaelin's words sank in. She didn't need to ask who was coming. The Duke's men, the royal guard, they would not stop until they had found her. And with the storm rolling in, the cover of darkness wouldn't help them for long. Kaelin's golden eyes flicked toward the mountains, his gaze calculating, assessing their options. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice sharp. "We need to move. Now." Lyra grabbed her sword, the familiar weight of it grounding her, and followed him as he moved swiftly toward the edge of their makeshift camp. The wind howled louder, as if warning them of the danger approaching. The mountains loomed in the distance, but between them and safety was a vast expanse of rocky terrain and thick forest. It would be difficult, treacherous, but they had no choice. The only way out was forward. The first signs of movement came from the treeline ahead. A flash of lantern light, barely visible through the dense fog, and the sound of boots crunching over the wet earth. They were close, too close for comfort. Kaelin's eyes narrowed, and he motioned for Lyra to follow him as he led them away from their camp, heading into the rocks and toward a narrow passage that led into the heart of the mountains. It was a path she knew well, a secret route her ancestors had used to escape danger in times of war. It would be their only hope. The wind picked up again, and the first raindrops began to fall, sharp and cold, hitting the ground with a staccato rhythm. The storm was coming in fast, but it would be their ally. The rain would cover their tracks, mask their scent, and make it harder for the hunters to follow. But that didn't mean they were safe, not yet. Lyra could hear the distant shouts of the royal guards as they began to spread out, searching for them. Their time was running out. She pushed herself harder, her legs burning as she matched Kaelin's pace, her eyes locked on the path ahead. There was no turning back now. They reached the narrow pass that led into the mountains, the jagged cliffs rising up on either side like the walls of a prison. Kaelin moved with purpose, his movements silent and swift, his body almost blending into the shadows. Lyra followed closely, every step calculated, every sound analyzed. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, and Lyra could hear the faintest scrape of metal. Someone was getting too close. "Keep moving," Kaelin urged, his voice barely a whisper, yet it was filled with an urgency that sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. The rain was falling harder now, a heavy downpour that blurred the world around them. Lyra's hair clung to her face, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she focused on keeping up with Kaelin's rapid pace. She could hear the rush of water beneath them, the sound of the creek that flowed through the pass, but that was all. The world had narrowed to just this, just survival. As they rounded a bend in the narrow path, Lyra's sharp eyes caught movement ahead. There was a figure, silhouetted in the mist, standing at the top of the pass. A soldier. No, more than one. They had reached the high ground. "Trap," Kaelin muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. He drew his sword in a single smooth motion, his golden eyes now flashing with a predatory gleam. "We can't go back," Lyra said, her voice steady, but her heart raced. "We're surrounded." "Not yet," Kaelin said, his voice filled with determination. "But we need to fight our way through. Ready yourself." Lyra gripped her sword tighter. She had faced countless battles in her life, but this was different. The odds were stacked against them, and the storm was their only advantage. She couldn't afford hesitation, not now. Kaelin's sword gleamed in the dim light, and he turned to face her. "Stay close to me," he said, his voice low but commanding. "Don't let them separate us." She nodded, her mind clearing as she fell into the familiar rhythm of battle. There would be no mercy. Not for them. Not for her. Not for Kaelin. The first wave of guards emerged from the mist, their armor glinting like pale ghosts in the storm. They advanced with a steady, coordinated march, their weapons drawn. Kaelin didn't hesitate. With a single step, he launched himself into the fray, his blade cutting through the air with deadly precision. Lyra was right behind him, her sword slashing through the rain, meeting steel with a force that sent sparks flying. The sound of clashing swords echoed through the narrow pass, mingling with the roar of the storm. Lyra moved with a fluid grace, her body a weapon, her instincts honed from years of training. She was a warrior, and this was her element. Kaelin's blade danced in the rain, striking with lethal efficiency, his every move calculated and precise. The guards were skilled, but they were no match for the raw power and speed that Kaelin brought to the fight. With every strike, he cut through their ranks, forcing them back. But there were too many. Lyra's breath came faster, the weight of the battle pressing down on her. She parried a blow, ducked under another, and slashed through the rain. Her body was screaming, but she couldn't stop. Not now. A guard lunged at her from the side, his sword raised high. Lyra twisted, her blade meeting his with a sharp clang. She shoved him back, her foot digging into the wet earth as she pushed forward. Then she saw it, a gap in the line, a chance to break through. She couldn't waste it. "Kaelin!" she shouted, her voice barely audible over the storm. He turned, his gaze locking with hers, and nodded. Without a word, he shifted his position, creating an opening in the guard's line. Lyra didn't hesitate. She surged forward, her sword cutting through the air, her heart pounding in her chest. They were almost there. The mountains were within reach, and freedom was waiting. But there was one last obstacle to overcome. Lyra's legs burned with every step as she pushed forward, the sound of the battle fading into the distance. The rain fell in sheets, cold and unforgiving, but she barely noticed. All that mattered now was getting through the narrow pass, escaping the clutches of the royal guards who pursued them. She could see the jagged rocks ahead, the pathway opening up into a wider valley that led up into the mountains. The high ground was just within reach. They would be safe there, for a moment. Kaelin fought beside her, his sword flashing in the dark like a streak of lightning, cutting down one guard after another. His movements were fluid, graceful, but there was a coldness to him now, an edge of something darker, more dangerous. It was as if the storm had awakened something deep inside him, a wolf that had been kept caged for far too long. They were nearly there. The last of the guards were retreating, regrouping, but the gap was wide enough now for them to escape. Lyra's heart hammered in her chest, but she didn't slow down. She was so close. A shout rang out from behind them, sharp and commanding, cutting through the roar of the storm. It was the captain of the royal guard. "Stop them!" he shouted, his voice carrying with terrifying authority. Lyra didn't dare turn back. She kept her eyes fixed on the mountain pass, but she could hear the thunder of hooves behind them now, the unmistakable sound of cavalry closing in. The royal guard wasn't done with them yet. Kaelin turned briefly, his eyes scanning the terrain before he looked back at her. "We need to move faster." Lyra nodded, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. She could feel the weight of the chase on her. Every footstep was a race against time. She pushed herself harder, her sword gripped tightly in her hand as she navigated the slippery rocks ahead. The gap between them and the cavalry closed quickly, and Lyra's heart raced with the knowledge that there was nowhere left to run. They had to make their stand now, or they would be overrun. "Kaelin!" she shouted, her voice strained with urgency. He turned, his golden eyes locking with hers. "We fight," he said, the words coming out in a growl. "We fight or we die." The choice was clear. They had no other option. They were warriors, and this was their fight. Kaelin moved ahead, positioning himself between Lyra and the advancing cavalry. The rain poured down around them, but it was like a veil, hiding them in the storm. He raised his sword, his posture shifting, ready for the fight to come. Lyra followed his lead, standing beside him. They were outnumbered, yes, but together they were stronger than anything that stood against them. The first of the cavalry riders burst through the trees, their horses thundering across the wet earth. Lyra didn't hesitate. She raised her sword, cutting down the first rider with a swift, deadly strike. The sound of metal meeting flesh rang in her ears, but there was no time to savor the victory. The next rider was already charging toward them, his lance aimed straight for Kaelin. Kaelin moved faster than Lyra could follow, his sword flashing in the dim light as he intercepted the blow, his body a blur of power and precision. With a quick twist, he disarmed the rider, sending him sprawling to the ground. Lyra fought alongside him, her blades slashing through the rain, meeting every attack with a fury that matched the storm. The cavalry were relentless, but Kaelin's skill and her own determination made them formidable opponents. For a moment, it seemed like they might actually win. The guards were retreating, some wounded, others too frightened to continue the fight. But then a shout rang out, a voice filled with venom and rage. "You think you can escape?" The voice was cold, familiar. Lyra froze. She knew that voice. Duke Valerius. Her blood ran cold as she turned toward the sound. There, standing in the mouth of the pass, was the Duke himself, flanked by his most trusted men. His expression was a mask of cold fury, his eyes burning with an ambition that Lyra had seen before. But this time, it was personal. "Kill them," he ordered, his voice dripping with malice. "Don't let them escape." The cavalry surged forward again, this time with the full force of the Duke's command behind them. Lyra's heart sank, but she refused to give in. She couldn't. Not now. Kaelin stepped forward, his sword raised, his voice filled with the raw authority of a king. "You'll have to kill me first." The Duke's gaze hardened. "I was hoping you'd say that." Lyra's breath caught in her throat as the Duke's men advanced, their weapons drawn. This was no longer just about survival. This was war. The storm raged around them, but in that moment, Lyra could only hear the pounding of her own heart, a frantic drumbeat in the chaos. The cavalry was advancing once more, their horses' hooves echoing in the night, thundering like a death march. Kaelin stood beside her, his stance unwavering, his eyes glowing with an intensity that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The Duke's voice cut through the storm, his words laced with malice. "You chose this path, Lyra. Now, you will pay for your foolishness." Lyra's grip tightened around the hilt of her sword. The Duke's men were closing in, but she wasn't going down without a fight. They wouldn't take her family, her home, or her people without a fight. Kaelin's sword gleamed in the dim light, his eyes never leaving the Duke. "You'll regret this," he muttered, almost to himself. But Lyra heard the promise in his words, felt the weight of his vow. The cavalry surged forward, their swords drawn, their faces masked with cold determination. The first rider charged, his lance aimed directly at Kaelin, but with a speed that left Lyra breathless, Kaelin intercepted the strike. His sword met the lance with a resounding clash, sending the rider stumbling back, but Kaelin was already in motion, his blade flashing as he struck the man down. Lyra was right behind him, moving with precision, her own sword cutting through the air with deadly accuracy. She didn't hesitate. She couldn't afford to. The enemy was closing in, but she would not let them win. She would fight until her last breath. The Duke's men were skilled, but Lyra and Kaelin were unstoppable. Every blow they dealt was a step closer to victory. But as the last of the cavalry fell, the Duke stepped forward, his cold eyes locking onto Kaelin's. "You've made a mistake, King Fenris," the Duke spat. "You can't win this battle." Kaelin's gaze didn't waver. He stepped toward the Duke, his sword raised in defiance. "You may have your army, Duke, but you don't have the heart of this land. You'll never control it." The Duke's eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might charge. But then something in Kaelin's stance, something in the way he stood as if the very earth beneath him would not be moved, made the Duke hesitate. "You think you're untouchable?" The Duke sneered. "I've already won." "No," Kaelin said, his voice low, almost a growl. "You've lost." With a single, swift motion, Kaelin turned his sword on the Duke. But before he could strike, the Duke's men surged forward again, this time from all sides, surrounding them both. Lyra's breath caught in her throat as the enemy closed in once more, but this time, it was different. Kaelin's sword was held steady, and his gaze never faltered. "We fight together," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. Lyra's heart beat in time with his words. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her people, her family, and the future she wanted to see. And Kaelin, this man who had been a stranger, was now her partner in this war. The promise of his words resonated in her very soul. They would win. Together. With a battle cry, they charged, moving in perfect sync as they cut down the remaining guards. Each strike was a testament to their strength, to the bond they had formed in the heat of battle. They were unstoppable, a force of nature that nothing could break. The Duke's forces were collapsing, retreating into the shadows as they realized the futility of their fight. But the Duke himself stood firm, his eyes filled with rage. He had underestimated them both. "Your reign ends here," Kaelin said, his voice thick with authority. With a single step, he crossed the distance between them, his blade raised high, ready to end it all. The Duke's face twisted with fury, but as Kaelin's sword came down, there was no escape. The man who had thought himself invincible was brought to his knees, his blood staining the earth beneath them. Lyra watched as the Duke crumpled, the once mighty man now defeated, his ambitions shattered. For the first time, she felt the weight of victory settle on her shoulders. They had won. The battle was over. Kaelin stood over the Duke, his sword dripping with blood, but his expression was calm, almost serene. He turned to Lyra, his golden eyes locking onto hers, a flicker of something soft in his gaze. "It's done." Lyra's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The weight of the battle, the danger, the fear, it all dissolved in the presence of this man, this king who had fought beside her. But there was no time for celebration. The storm raged on, and they knew the fight was far from over. They had won this battle, but the war was still ahead. Kaelin sheathed his sword, and Lyra did the same. They didn't speak, but the understanding between them was clear. They had just begun this fight, and together they would face whatever came next. The rain continued to fall, relentless and heavy, as the storm enveloped the land. The battle had been won, but the weight of the war ahead still hung heavily over Lyra and Kaelin. The Duke's forces had been scattered, their ambition crushed under the weight of Kaelin's blade, but the true fight was far from over. The forest was eerily silent now, the sounds of the battle fading into the distance. The only thing that remained was the tension between them. The knowledge that this moment, however victorious, was a brief respite before the storm. Kaelin wiped the blood from his sword, his expression unreadable. He was a king, a warrior, but in this moment, Lyra saw something more in him. She saw the man who had chosen to fight for a cause greater than his throne, the man who had fought beside her, not because of his title, but because he believed in her. "You did it," Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We did it." Kaelin's gaze met hers, a flicker of something softer than the coldness she had seen in him before. "It's not over yet," he said, his voice low, but there was an edge to it, a fire that hadn't dulled with the end of the battle. "This is just the beginning." Lyra nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. The victory they had won tonight meant little if they couldn't use it to end the corruption that had spread through the kingdom. Valerius's grip on power was still strong, and his plans for the throne were far from finished. The true test of their resolve had only just begun. Kaelin turned, his eyes scanning the horizon where the mountains loomed, the storm clouds gathering in the distance like a warning of what was to come. "We need to head to Ridgefall. The Stoneclaw clan may be the key to stopping this. But we can't waste any more time. We need their support, and fast." Lyra followed his gaze, her thoughts drifting to her clan. Ridgefall had always been a place of strength, a fortress built on the foundation of her family's legacy. But now it was more than just her home. It was the last bastion of resistance against the Duke's corruption. The Stoneclaw clan was their only hope for an alliance, and without it, they would stand little chance of winning the war to come. "I'll go," Lyra said, her voice firm with determination. "But we'll need more than just their support. We'll need to convince them that this fight is worth it, that our people are worth it." Kaelin's eyes softened as he met her gaze. "You're not alone in this. We'll do it together. We'll make them see the truth." The promise in his words was all she needed. She had spent her life alone, fighting for her family, for her people, but now, with Kaelin by her side, she wasn't just a warrior anymore. She was a leader, and together they would lead their people to victory. They moved through the forest, their steps quick and purposeful. The storm had started to break, the first rays of dawn pushing through the clouds, casting a faint golden light over the landscape. It was a new day, and with it came the hope of a new beginning. As they neared the mountain pass that would take them to Ridgefall, Kaelin turned to Lyra, his gaze intense. "You're ready for this, Lyra. You've been ready for this your whole life." Lyra didn't speak, but the fire in her chest was enough. She had always known she was destined for something greater than what had been given to her. She had always known that the path ahead would be difficult, but now, standing beside Kaelin, she knew that together, they could take on anything. The path to Ridgefall was long, but it was the only way forward. There was no going back. The journey to Ridgefall was long and fraught with danger. Every step they took seemed to lead them deeper into the wilderness, farther from the life they had once known. The path was steep, the rocks slippery beneath their feet, and the storm had left the earth slick with rain and mud. But none of it mattered. Every step brought them closer to the Stoneclaw clan, closer to the alliance they so desperately needed. Lyra and Kaelin moved through the landscape in a silence that spoke volumes. They were no longer just two people thrown together by fate. They were allies, partners in a war that would decide the future of the kingdom. And despite the storm that raged around them, despite the uncertainty that lay ahead, Lyra couldn't help but feel a sense of peace settle over her. She was no longer alone. Kaelin was there, with her, beside her, ready to face whatever came next. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they reached the foot of the mountain where Ridgefall stood. The fortress rose from the rocky cliffs like a sentinel, its stone walls dark against the fading light of day. The scent of pine and damp earth filled the air, and the distant sound of wolves howling echoed through the valley, a reminder of the untamed wilderness that surrounded them. Ridgefall, Lyra whispered, her voice thick with emotion. This place, this fortress, had always been a symbol of her family's strength. But now it was more than that. It was the last hope for the kingdom. We need to approach carefully, Kaelin said, his voice low. The Stoneclaws won't trust us easily, especially with everything that's happening. We can't afford to make any mistakes. Lyra nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of the task ahead. Convincing the Stoneclaw clan to join their cause was no small feat. They were fierce warriors, loyal to their bloodlines, and their hatred of the Northern Ridge was well known. If she couldn't win them over, the kingdom would fall, and all would be lost. They approached the gates of Ridgefall, the towering stone walls looming above them. The wind had picked up again, biting at their skin, and the air was thick with the scent of the forest. Lyra could feel her pulse quicken as they drew closer. This was it. There was no turning back now. A single guard stood at the gate, his eyes narrow as he studied them. His armor was battered, a reflection of the constant battles the Stoneclaws fought to defend their land. He looked them up and down, his expression unreadable. "I am Lyra of the Northern Ridge," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves bubbling inside her. "I come seeking an audience with Lord Forlag. We have urgent matters to discuss." The guard didn't move, his gaze never leaving her. "Lord Forlag does not entertain visitors on a whim," he said, his voice gruff. "State your business and make it quick." Lyra's heart pounded in her chest, but she met his gaze with a calmness she didn't entirely feel. "The Duke Valerius seeks to destroy us all. The kingdom is at war, and we need your support. We need the Stoneclaws." For a moment, the guard didn't speak, his eyes shifting between her and Kaelin. Then, without a word, he turned and motioned for them to follow. "Come with me. Lord Forlag will decide what to do with you." The walk through the fortress was tense, every step taking them deeper into the heart of the Stoneclaw clan's stronghold. The walls were thick with history, each one a testament to the warriors who had come before. Lyra couldn't help but feel the weight of her ancestors' presence as they moved through the halls. The Stoneclaws were a proud people, their honor as strong as the mountains they called home. Finally, they reached the great hall. The doors were carved with intricate designs, depicting battles and triumphs of the past. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burning wood, and the fire in the hearth cast flickering shadows on the stone walls. At the far end of the hall sat Lord Forlag, his massive form a stark contrast to the simplicity of the room. His eyes were like steel, cold and calculating, but there was something else in them, a deep, ancient wisdom that made Lyra uneasy. He didn't speak as they entered, but his gaze shifted from Kaelin to Lyra, sizing them up with a single look. He was a man who had seen a lifetime of battles, who had lived through betrayals and alliances alike. His presence was commanding, and for a moment, Lyra felt small in the face of it. "You come seeking the Stoneclaw's help," Lord Forlag said, his voice deep and rumbling, like the growl of an old bear. "Why should we risk our necks for you, Lyra of the Northern Ridge? Your family has long been our enemies." Lyra's heart skipped. This was the moment that would decide everything. "Because I am not my father," she said, her voice steady, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Because the kingdom is on the brink of destruction, and if we don't stand together, we will fall alone. Lord Forlag's eyes narrowed, but he didn't speak. Instead, he motioned for them to sit, his sharp gaze never leaving their faces. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, each second feeling like an eternity. "You've come to the right place," he finally said, his voice low but filled with a quiet authority. "But know this, Lyra of the Northern Ridge. The Stoneclaws do not fight for weak hearts. We fight for strength. We fight for those who stand tall in the face of adversity." Lyra met his gaze, her resolve hardening. "I stand for what is right, and I will not back down." Lord Forlag's lips curled into a grim smile. "Then you will have our support. For now. But you will have to prove yourself worthy. Prove that you have the strength to lead, and we will fight beside you." Kaelin's eyes flickered with approval, but Lyra didn't allow herself to relax. This was just the beginning. The Stoneclaws had given them a chance, but that chance came with a heavy price. She would prove herself worthy. The wind howled through the mountain passes as Lyra and Kaelin left Lord Forlag's hall. Their path ahead uncertain, but now marked by a glimmer of hope. The Stoneclaws had agreed to join their cause, but the price of that alliance weighed heavily on Lyra. They would fight for her, but only if she could prove herself worthy, not just as the daughter of a lord, but as a true leader, capable of guiding them through the storm. That was coming. They walked in silence for a time, the only sounds the crunch of their boots on the rocky ground and the distant roar of the wind. The night was cold, and the forest around them seemed to hold its breath. The atmosphere was thick with tension, a feeling that neither Lyra nor Kaelin could shake. They were headed toward the heart of the kingdom, toward the confrontation that had been brewing ever since Lyra made her choice at the choosing ceremony. Kaelin glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice low, yet filled with an underlying urgency. Lyra didn't answer immediately. She had been asking herself the same question for hours. They had the Stoneclaw's support, but Valerius's forces were growing stronger by the day, and the Duke had more allies than anyone realized. This was no longer just about her family's survival. It was about the survival of the kingdom itself. "I don't know," Lyra said at last, her voice filled with a quiet determination. "But we keep moving forward. We have to. The kingdom depends on us." Kaelin nodded, his gaze turning to the path ahead. The darkness of the night seemed to mirror the uncertainty of their situation, but something in Kaelin's posture, the quiet strength in his movements, gave Lyra a sense of calm. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone in this fight. They made their way to the small camp near the base of Ridgefall, where their warriors were resting. The night was long, and Lyra knew the battle would soon begin. Her thoughts drifted to her people, her family, and the ones she had promised to protect. The weight of the kingdom's future pressed on her shoulders like a heavy cloak, but she would not falter. She couldn't. When they reached the camp, the warriors stood and gathered around them, their faces grim and ready. They were a mixture of Stoneclaws, Ridgefall's own defenders, and Lyra's loyal followers. The fires in the camp flickered in the wind, casting long shadows on the stone walls around them. The air was thick with the scent of earth and the smoke of their fire, and for a moment, Lyra felt a pang of nostalgia for the life she had known before all of this. But there was no going back. "Listen up," she called, her voice cutting through the murmur of the warriors. "We've gained an ally, but that doesn't mean victory is certain. The Duke is still out there, and we've only begun to uncover his plans. We must be ready for anything." The warriors stood in a circle around her, their faces a mixture of determination and resolve. Kaelin stepped forward, his presence filling the space. "We're not just fighting for Ridgefall or the Northern Ridge," he said, his voice booming with authority. "We're fighting for the entire kingdom. For those who have no voice, for those who have been silenced by men like Valerius. This is our fight." The camp fell into a deep silence as Kaelin's words settled over them. There was no more room for doubt, no more room for fear. They were in this together, and together they would win. "We make our stand tomorrow," Lyra said, her voice firm, commanding. "We strike first, disrupt their supply lines, and take the fight to the Duke. We'll fight for every inch of land, for every life he's taken, and for every person who believes in the future we can build together." The warriors around her nodded, their eyes filled with a new fire. They weren't just following orders. They were ready to fight, to die, if necessary, to protect the kingdom from the corruption that had festered within it for too long. Lyra turned to Kaelin, her heart pounding in her chest. "We're ready," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "We have to be." Kaelin placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze soft but unwavering. "We will be. Together." The hours before dawn felt like an eternity, each passing minute heavy with the weight of the decisions to come. Lyra lay awake beside the fire, her thoughts swirling. The fight was no longer just about survival. It was about restoring balance, about honoring the sacrifices of those who had come before her. Her ancestors, the warriors who had fought in the old wars, the ones whose blood ran through her veins. They had given their lives for the land, for the people. It was time for her to do the same. She closed her eyes, her hand resting on the hilt of her sword. Tomorrow, they would face the Duke and his men. Tomorrow, they would take the fight to the heart of the kingdom. And Lyra would not fail them. She couldn't. The first light of dawn began to break through the horizon, casting a pale light over the camp. Lyra rose, her body aching from the night's restless sleep, but her heart was clear. She was ready. They were ready. "Let's go," Kaelin said quietly, his voice a low murmur beside her. The warriors began to stir, gathering their weapons and preparing for the battle ahead. The storm had passed, and the day was theirs for the taking. The morning light crept over the jagged peaks of the mountains, casting long shadows across the camp. The air was crisp, the scent of pine and damp earth sharp in Lyra's lungs as she stood at the edge of the camp, looking toward the horizon. The sky was clear now, but the storm had left its mark, both on the land and in her heart. She could feel the weight of what was about to happen, the clash of steel and blood that would decide the fate of her kingdom. She turned to Kaelin, who stood beside her, his face grim but determined. His golden eyes held a fire that matched her own, a fire that had been kindled in the heart of battle and fueled by the shared promise they had made. To defeat the Duke, to take back the kingdom that had been stolen from them. "Are we ready?" Lyra asked, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts that churned in her mind. Kaelin nodded, his expression unreadable. "As ready as we'll ever be. We strike at dawn. We hit their supply lines, disrupt their forces, and take the fight to Valerius himself." The warriors around them were preparing for the battle, their movements swift and precise. They were a mix of the Stoneclaws, Lyra's loyal followers, and Ridgefall's defenders. Together, they had formed an army that was stronger than the sum of its parts. They had the heart of the people, and with that, they had the power to change the course of history. Lyra could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. The Stoneclaws had agreed to fight, but it was up to her to lead them. She had earned their respect, but the true test of her leadership was about to begin. She had to prove herself, not just to them, but to herself. "We do this for the kingdom," Lyra said, her voice rising as she addressed the warriors who had gathered around her. "For the people who have been oppressed, for those who have suffered under Valerius's rule. We fight not just for Ridgefall, but for the future of the entire kingdom. Today we take back what is rightfully ours." A cheer erupted from the warriors, their voices rising like a roar of thunder in the mountains. Lyra's heart swelled with pride, her spirit lifted by their resolve. They were united in this fight, and together, they would make a stand that would echo through history. Kaelin stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the assembled warriors. "We have one chance at this. We cannot afford to fail. The Duke is a snake, but we are the wolves of the north, and wolves fight until their last breath." Lyra's chest tightened at his words. The Duke had underestimated them, thinking that the bonds between them could be easily broken. But Kaelin was right. They were not just fighting for survival. They were fighting for something greater. They were fighting for the freedom of the people, for the future of the kingdom, and for the strength of their alliance. The battle was upon them. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting a golden glow over the land as the army moved toward the heart of the Duke's territory. The forest opened up to reveal a vast expanse of plains, where the Duke's forces had set up camp. Lyra could see the soldiers moving about, preparing for the fight, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit them. Lyra and Kaelin led their warriors in a swift, silent advance, moving through the trees and into the open ground. The wind had picked up again, but it didn't slow them down. The first wave of their forces would hit the supply lines, taking out the Duke's food and ammunition stores. Without those, the Duke's army would be crippled. "We move quickly," Kaelin ordered, his voice low and commanding. "We hit them fast and hard. Leave no survivors. Lyra nodded, her hand tight on the hilt of her sword. She had fought in battles before, but this one was different. The stakes were higher, the risk greater. But she knew she couldn't back down. Not now. The first skirmish came quickly. The enemy soldiers appeared from the trees, their weapons drawn and their faces set in grim determination. But they were no match for the warriors of Ridgefall and the Stoneclaws. Lyra and Kaelin fought side by side, their blades flashing through the air, cutting down their enemies with brutal precision. The sound of clashing swords and the cries of battle filled the air as the two armies collided in the center of the field. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest as she fought, her body moving on instinct, her blade a blur as it cut through the enemy ranks. She could hear Kaelin beside her, his growls of rage mixing with the sounds of the battle. They were unstoppable, a force of nature that nothing could break. But the Duke's forces were relentless, and soon reinforcements arrived. The battle grew more intense as the enemy soldiers pressed forward, their numbers overwhelming. Lyra fought on, her body aching with exhaustion, but she couldn't stop. Not now. We need to finish this, Kaelin shouted, his voice carrying over the battlefield. We need to break their lines. Lyra nodded, her gaze locked on the enemy forces. The battle was turning in their favor, but they couldn't afford to lose momentum. They had to break the Duke's grip on the kingdom once and for all. As the sun reached its zenith, Lyra saw her opportunity. She broke through the enemy lines, charging toward the Duke's command center. She could see him now, standing in the midst of his soldiers, watching the battle unfold with a cold, calculating gaze. With a shout, Lyra charged forward, her sword raised high. The Duke's soldiers tried to stop her, but she fought her way through them, cutting down anyone who dared to stand in her path. Kaelin was right behind her, his presence a constant reminder of the promise they had made. To fight, to win, to never give up. The Duke turned as he saw them approaching, his eyes narrowing with rage. You think you can defeat me? He snarled. Lyra's lips curled into a grim smile. I don't think. I know. With that, she lunged forward, her sword aimed straight for the Duke's heart. The battlefield was a maelstrom of noise, swords clashing, men shouting, the distant crack of arrows in flight, and the shrill cries of war. But in that moment, all of it faded into the background. Lyra's eyes were fixed on the Duke, his face twisted in fury as he saw her charging toward him, his own soldiers scrambling to intercept her. But she wouldn't stop. She couldn't. Her feet pounded the earth beneath her, the air thick with the scent of blood and rain, her sword steady in her grip. She could hear Kaelin's growl behind her, the sound of him cutting through the enemy as he followed her lead. They were a unit unstoppable, and nothing, not even the Duke, would stand in their way. The Duke's eyes flashed with recognition, his hands gripping the hilt of his own sword. You think you can defeat me, girl? He spat, stepping forward to meet her. His voice was dripping with contempt, but there was fear in his eyes, a fear that only fueled Lyra's resolve. I don't think, she replied, her voice icy with determination. I know. With a roar, the Duke swung his sword toward her, his movements precise and deadly, but Lyra was faster. She ducked, narrowly avoiding the strike, and countered with a slash of her own, her blade cutting through the air with the force of her fury. She was done being afraid, done being the daughter of a lord, living in the shadows of others. This was her battle, her fight, and she would win. The Duke blocked her strike with a forceful parry, his face twisted with rage. You're nothing but a child playing in a man's world, he sneered, his sword moving in a fluid, deadly arc. Lyra's heart raced, but she didn't hesitate. She was done listening to the lies, done being cast aside because of her scars, her past, her family. She was more than what they saw, more than what the Duke could ever comprehend. You're wrong, she said, her voice steady as she met his strike with a resounding clash. I am everything they said I couldn't be. With a savage twist of her sword, Lyra pushed him back, forcing him to stumble. She didn't give him a moment to recover. She pressed the attack, her movements precise, each strike calculated. The Duke, once so sure of his victory, now found himself on the defensive. His arrogance was his undoing. You're a failure, Valerius, Kaelin's voice rang out from behind her, his sword cutting through the Duke's men like a hot knife through butter. You've always been one. The Duke's eyes flicked to Kaelin, and in that brief moment of distraction, Lyra seized her chance. She stepped forward, her sword a blur, and struck with all the power she could muster. The Duke's sword collided with hers, but his strength was waning and his grip faltered. The moment his guard dropped, Lyra made her move. With a swift and precise strike, she drove her blade through his heart. The Duke's eyes widened in shock as he crumpled to the ground, his body falling like a sack of stone. The moment the life drained from his eyes, the battlefield seemed to fall silent. For a heartbeat, Lyra stood over him, her chest heaving with exertion. The weight of what she had just done settled over her. But there was no regret. Only the knowledge that she had done what needed to be done. She had taken back control of her kingdom. She had won. The warriors around her paused, their attention drawn to the fallen Duke. A cheer erupted from the ranks of her army, the sound of victory ringing through the air like a clarion call. The battle was over. The Duke's reign of terror had come to an end. But the fight was far from over. Kaelin stepped forward, his face unreadable as he looked down at the Duke's body. He was no longer just the man who had fought beside her. He was the king, the true ruler of the kingdom. And in that moment, Lyra realized that everything had changed. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Kaelin looked at her, his golden eyes filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. "No," he said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the future. "This is just the beginning." The days that followed were a blur of preparation, rebuilding, and gathering what was left of the kingdom's forces. The war wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. There were still those loyal to the Duke's cause, still factions who believed they could tear the kingdom apart. But for the first time, Lyra felt something she hadn't in years. Hope. The Stoneclaws stood with her. Kaelin stood with her. Her people had rallied behind her, and together, they would rebuild what had been broken. But there was still much to do. Lyra stood on the balcony of Ridgefall, looking out over the lands that had once been ruled by fear and greed. Now they were hers to protect. The road ahead would be hard, but it was one she was ready to walk. She wasn't alone anymore. "Together," she whispered to herself, her voice steady as she turned back toward Kaelin, who stood in the doorway, watching her with a look of quiet admiration. Together, they would rebuild the kingdom. Together, they would forge a future worthy of their people. And nothing would stand in their way. The days after the battle seemed to stretch endlessly before Lyra. The storm that had torn through the kingdom had passed, but its effects lingered in the form of broken families, fallen warriors, and shattered alliances. Yet amidst the devastation, there was a fire burning, one that refused to be extinguished. The kingdom, though scarred, had not been broken, not while Lyra and Kaelin still breathed. Ridgefall was alive with activity, the once silent halls now echoing with voices and the clatter of armor. The warriors, their blood still fresh from the battle, worked alongside the healers, the wounded, and the rest of the people, each one playing their part in the restoration. Lyra watched them, her heart swelling with pride. This was her kingdom now. It had always been hers, even before she'd known it. But it wasn't just the people of Ridgefall who were working to rebuild. From all corners of the kingdom, the call for unity had been answered. The Stoneclaws, loyal as ever, had sent reinforcements, offering both warriors and supplies. And across the northern lands, the once disparate clans were beginning to pull together, drawn not just by the strength of Lyra's leadership, but by the hope she had sparked in them all. As Lyra walked through the camp, her thoughts were consumed with the task at hand. They needed to consolidate their forces, secure the borders, and begin the slow process of healing. The kingdom had been fractured for too long, and it was up to her to mend it, one piece at a time. She found Kaelin by the fire, a map spread out before him, his brow furrowed as he studied the terrain. He had become more than a king to her. He was a partner, a man who had stood beside her from the very beginning, and together they had fought for something greater than themselves. "You're thinking about the next battle, aren't you?" Lyra asked softly as she approached, her eyes scanning the map as well. Kaelin looked up at her, his golden eyes locking with hers. "Always," he replied, though there was a glimmer of something else in his gaze, something softer, more personal. "But this isn't just about fighting anymore. It's about rebuilding, about ensuring that we don't make the same mistakes again." Lyra nodded, her heart swelling with understanding. "We need to unite the kingdom, Kaelin. We can't afford any more division. It's not just about taking back what's ours. It's about ensuring that what we build is stronger than what came before." Kaelin's gaze softened, and he reached out, placing his hand over hers. "You're right, but it's going to take time. Trust, loyalty, unity. It can't be forced. We have to let it grow naturally." The words hit her harder than she expected. She had spent so much of her life fighting, protecting, surviving. The idea of building something lasting, something that didn't depend on her strength alone, was both foreign and terrifying. But Kaelin was right. They had to rebuild not just the kingdom, but the trust of the people within it. "We'll do it together," Lyra said firmly, her voice filled with a strength she didn't even know she had. "We've already taken the first step. Now we build. Together." Kaelin smiled, his hand tightening around hers. Together. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Lyra and Kaelin worked tirelessly, visiting villages, speaking with leaders, and forging alliances with those who had remained neutral during the war. It wasn't easy. There were still pockets of resistance, remnants of the Duke's loyalists who refused to accept the new order. But Lyra's leadership had proven itself on the battlefield, and now it was proving itself in diplomacy. As the days passed, the kingdom began to heal, slowly but surely. The people who had once feared the tyranny of the Duke were now looking to Lyra for guidance. And she gave it, leading with a strength that was tempered by compassion. She was no longer just the daughter of Lord Kaelin. She was a queen, and she would rule with wisdom, honor, and strength. But there were still dangers lurking in the shadows. The threat from Valerius's remaining supporters was real, and Lyra knew they couldn't afford to be complacent. The peace they had won was fragile, and it was up to her and Kaelin to protect it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the mountains, Lyra stood by the edge of the fortress, her eyes scanning the distant landscape. The winds had calmed, and the silence was a welcome change from the constant din of battle and rebuilding. Kaelin joined her, standing by her side in comfortable silence. For a moment, there was no war, no political struggle, no weight on her shoulders. There was only the quiet of the world around them, the soft rustling of the trees, and the distant call of a lone wolf in the hills. "You know," Kaelin said quietly, his voice low and intimate, "I never imagined this for myself. Not in 100 lifetimes." Lyra turned to him, her gaze soft. "What did you imagine?" He shrugged, his gaze distant. "I don't know. A throne, a crown, a kingdom. But I never imagined a kingdom like this. I never imagined this," he gestured to her, to them. "This life we're building." Lyra smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "It's ours to build, Kaelin, and I couldn't imagine doing it with anyone else." He turned to her, his golden eyes filled with quiet affection. "Then we'll build it together. A kingdom of strength, of honor, of love. A place where no one has to fight alone. A place where we're all united." The weight of the future seemed lighter now, the road ahead clearer. Lyra wasn't alone anymore. Neither of them were. Together, they would rebuild the kingdom. Together, they would create something that would last for generations to come. As the last light of the day faded, Lyra felt a sense of peace settle over her. The storm was over. The fight was won. And the future, for the first time, felt filled with limitless possibilities. The days following the battle were filled with long hours of negotiations, councils, and discussions. The kingdom, once fractured and broken, was slowly coming together under Lyra's rule. But there were still obstacles to overcome, still wounds to heal. The alliance with the Stoneclaws had given them a solid foundation, but not every clan was willing to follow. There were old grudges, old alliances that needed to be untangled, and Lyra knew that every decision she made would echo through the kingdom for generations to come. As the first month after the battle drew to a close, Lyra found herself standing at the edge of Ridgefall, looking out over the lands that stretched beyond. The mountain peaks were capped with snow, the valleys below dotted with villages beginning to recover from the ravages of war. It was a landscape that had once been filled with bloodshed and fear, but now it seemed to pulse with life and potential. Her kingdom was beginning to heal, but Lyra knew that the real work had only just begun. Kaelin joined her, his steps silent against the stone as he came to stand beside her. The cool air of the morning wrapped around them, a reminder that despite the changes they had made, the world outside still held the harshness of the wilds. "You're thinking of the future, aren't you?" Kaelin asked, his voice quiet, as if sensing the weight of her thoughts. Lyra turned to face him, her eyes filled with the weight of the decision ahead. "There's still so much to do, so many challenges to face. We've brought the clans together, but the hardest part is yet to come. We need to unite the people, Kaelin. We need to build something that lasts, something that stands beyond just the two of us." Kaelin's golden eyes met hers, his expression thoughtful. "You're not alone in this, Lyra. You never have been. And you won't be. Her heart fluttered at his words, the bond between them deepening with every passing day. She had never imagined that her life would take this path, that she would find herself here, standing on the precipice of a new era. But she had found something in Kaelin that went beyond the throne, beyond the title of king. She had found a partner, someone who understood the weight of leadership and the sacrifice it demanded. I know, she said softly, but the kingdom needs more than just 2 rulers. It needs the strength of the people. It needs their trust. We need to build a future where they believe in us, where they believe in each other. Kaelin nodded, his gaze steady. We will build that future. Together. We'll be the foundation, but it's the people who will make this kingdom their own. We will lead with honor, with strength, and with love. Lyra smiled, a weight lifting from her shoulders as she looked at him. You've always known the right words to say. I've learned them from you, Kaelin replied, his voice warm. You've shown me what it means to be more than just a king. You've shown me what it means to be a leader, a protector, and a partner. The silence between them was filled with understanding, a mutual respect that had grown through the trials they had faced together. It was a bond that went beyond mere words. It was a connection that would hold them steady through the challenges ahead. You're right, Lyra said, her voice steady with resolve. We've fought to survive, but now we fight to build. For the future. For the people. Kaelin reached out, taking her hand in his. And we'll do it together. Whatever comes, we'll face it side by side. Lyra's heart swelled with pride and hope. The future was uncertain, but with Kaelin by her side and the strength of the kingdom behind her, she knew they could overcome anything. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting its golden light over the mountains. And for the first time in a long time, Lyra felt the weight of the world shift from her shoulders. There was still much to do, but they would do it together. They would build a kingdom not based on fear or conquest, but on unity and strength. A kingdom that would stand the test of time. We should return to the council, Lyra said, her voice firm with purpose. There's much to discuss. Kaelin nodded, and together they turned back toward Ridgefall, their steps in sync, their hearts in harmony. The kingdom was theirs to rebuild. The future was theirs to shape. And with that, they walked into the dawn of a new era. The council hall was alive with the buzz of conversation as Lyra and Kaelin entered. Warriors, leaders, and advisors from across the kingdom had gathered, each one representing a different clan or faction. The room was filled with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Anticipation for the future, and anxiety over what that future might hold. Lyra felt the weight of their gazes as they turned to her. She was no longer just the daughter of Lord Kaelin. She was their queen. Her decisions would shape the lives of every person in the room, and every person beyond those walls. The silence in the hall was palpable, as if the entire kingdom was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. Kaelin stood beside her, his presence a silent reassurance. Together, they would guide the kingdom. Together, they would make sure that this new era would be one of strength, unity, and justice. Lyra stepped forward, her heart steady despite the nervous energy in the air. Thank you all for coming, she began, her voice steady and strong. We stand at the precipice of a new future, one that we must build together. The days of division are over. The days of fighting among ourselves must end now, or we will be consumed by our own weakness. Her words rang out, a call for unity that resonated through the room. She could feel the tension begin to ease, replaced by a cautious hope. They were listening, and they were ready. I know that there are many here who have suffered, she continued, her gaze sweeping across the room. The scars of war are deep, and the pain runs long. But we cannot afford to dwell on the past. We must move forward together. We must build a kingdom where every person has a voice, where every clan, no matter their size or strength, has a place. There was a murmur of agreement from the council, but Lyra could see the skepticism in their eyes. It was one thing to speak of unity, and another to make it a reality. She turned to Kaelin, who gave her a reassuring nod. Together, she said, her voice growing stronger. We have fought for this kingdom. Together, we will rebuild it. She knew it wouldn't be easy. There were still those who were loyal to the old ways, who believed that power should be seized by force, that strength came from domination. But those voices were growing quieter with every passing day. She could see it in the faces of the council members, in their willingness to listen. Kaelin stepped forward, his presence commanding the room. Lyra speaks the truth. We are not here to seek revenge. We are not here to divide. We are here to unite. For the people. For the land. For the future. The weight of his words seemed to settle over the room. The council shifted, and Lyra felt the momentum building. They weren't just listening anymore. They were considering the possibility of something different. Something better. But unity doesn't come easily, Kalen continued, his voice strong. We must all make sacrifices. We must all be willing to lay down old grudges and open ourselves to new alliances. The kingdom is only as strong as the bonds we form, and it's up to us to forge those bonds. Lyra nodded, her eyes scanning the room. The time for division is over. This is our chance to build a future that is stronger than the past. But we must be honest with ourselves. We must acknowledge the mistakes we've made and learn from them. A voice from the back of the room spoke up. And how do we know we can trust you, Lyra? How do we know that this isn't just another power grab, another false promise? Lyra's gaze locked onto the man who had spoken, a leader of a smaller clan. His suspicion was understandable, given the turmoil they had endured. But she wasn't here to make empty promises. She was here to show them that she was different, that they were different. You don't have to trust me, she said, her voice steady and unwavering. But you can trust what we've built. You can trust the bonds we've formed on the battlefield. You can trust that I will fight for this kingdom, not as a ruler, but as one of you. There was a heavy silence after her words, and for a moment, Lyra wondered if she had gone too far. But then slowly, one by one, members of the council nodded. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A shift. A change. The man who had spoken earlier stepped forward, his gaze steady. We've lost much, but we're still here. We're still standing. And if you're willing to stand with us, to fight for us, then I think we can make this work. Lyra felt her heart lift at his words. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for. The beginning of something real. We will rebuild, she said, her voice resolute. Together, the kingdom will stand strong, and we will all have a place in it. The council murmured in agreement, the tension finally breaking. Lyra could feel the weight lifting from her shoulders. The road ahead was still uncertain, still fraught with challenges. But for the first time in her life, she felt like she wasn't carrying it alone. She turned to Kalen, her heart filled with gratitude. He gave her a small, knowing smile, as if he had been waiting for this moment too. We've won this battle, Kalen said quietly, his voice filled with quiet pride. But the war is not over. There's still much to do. But this is the beginning. Lyra nodded, her eyes scanning the council. She could see the beginnings of trust forming, the first steps toward a unified future. It wasn't going to be easy. It would take time, patience, and effort. But they would do it, together. The following weeks brought a new rhythm to the kingdom. The frantic pace of battle had slowed, replaced by the steady grind of rebuilding. Lyra had always been a warrior, a fighter, but now she was learning to be something more, a leader in the truest sense. A leader who had to negotiate, strategize, and unite those who had been torn apart by years of war. The council had convened several times since that pivotal day. Lyra and Kalen had worked tirelessly, forging new alliances, strengthening old ones, and navigating the delicate balance of power that came with uniting a fractured kingdom. It was exhausting work, but it was also exhilarating. Every step forward felt like a victory, no matter how small. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, casting a golden hue over Ridgefall, Lyra found herself standing at the balcony once again, staring out over the lands she had sworn to protect. The wind was cool against her skin, and the faint scent of pine and earth filled her senses. This was her kingdom now. This was her responsibility. Thinking about the future again? Kalen's voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to see him approaching, his silhouette framed by the warm light of the setting sun. Lyra smiled at him, a tired but contented smile. I can't help it, she said, her voice thoughtful. There's still so much to do. The clans are beginning to unite, but the kingdom is still fragile. The people, they've suffered so much. We have to make sure we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. Kalen stepped closer, his presence a steady comfort. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle but firm. We've made more progress than we think, he said softly. The people are starting to trust us, Lyra. We've shown them that we can lead, not with power, but with honor. That's what matters. Lyra nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She could feel the weight of the future pressing down on her. But Kalen's words were a balm to her weary heart. They had come a long way, but there was still a long road ahead. We've done a lot, she said quietly, But we can't stop now. We need to show the people that this kingdom belongs to them, that their voices matter. We need to build a future that isn't just about survival, but about thriving, about creating a place where everyone, no matter their clan, their title, or their past, has a role. Kaelin squeezed her shoulder. And we will, one step at a time. As they stood together in silence, Lyra couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope rise within her. For the first time in her life, she could see the possibility of a future where peace wasn't just a fleeting dream. It could be real. It would be real. Days turned into weeks, and the work of rebuilding continued. The people of the kingdom began to embrace the changes Lyra and Kaelin were implementing. The once disparate clans were beginning to unite, their loyalty shifting from the warlord mentality to the idea of a shared kingdom. The tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by the hum of activity. The sound of hands rebuilding, of families returning to their lands, of farmers planting crops again. The war was over, but the struggle for peace was just beginning. Lyra and Kaelin spent their days traveling between the various clans, offering guidance and forging alliances. Everywhere they went, they were met with cautious optimism. People had seen what Lyra had done for the kingdom, how she had led her people into battle, how she had stood beside Kaelin as an equal, never once backing down. Her reputation had grown, not just as the daughter of Lord Kaelin, but as a true leader in her own right. But not all were convinced. There were still whispers in the shadows, still those who clung to the old ways, who believed that power should be seized, not earned. Lyra knew this would be their greatest challenge. They had to prove, day by day, that the future they were building was worth believing in, that it wasn't just a dream. One evening, as they made their way back to Ridgefall after a particularly long council meeting with the eastern clans, Kaelin turned to Lyra with a thoughtful look in his eyes. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice serious. "We've made a lot of progress, but there's still one thing we haven't addressed. The throne. Your claim to the crown. It's still unrecognized by some of the larger clans." Lyra stopped in her tracks, her eyes meeting his with an unspoken understanding. She had known this conversation was coming. It had always been a matter of when, not if. "I've never wanted the throne," she said quietly, her voice steady but filled with an undeniable edge. "I never asked for it. But the kingdom needs stability, Kaelin. And if that means stepping into the role of queen, then I will. I'll do whatever it takes." Kaelin nodded, his gaze unwavering. "You've already proven yourself, Lyra. You've shown that you're a leader, not because of a title, but because of your actions. But there are still those who will question your legitimacy. It's time to address it." Lyra's mind raced. The idea of formally claiming the throne, of taking her place as the rightful ruler of the kingdom, filled her with both pride and a deep sense of trepidation. She had led the people in battle, had fought for their survival. But this was different. This was about owning her place in history. "I'm not doing this for the title," she said, her voice resolute. "I'm doing this for the kingdom, for the people who believe in us. They need to see that we're committed, that we're in this for the long haul." Kaelin placed his hand on hers, his touch grounding her in the moment. "Then we'll do it together. This is your kingdom, Lyra. We'll make sure the people know it." Lyra met his gaze, her heart swelling with determination. The road ahead would be difficult, but they would face it together. The kingdom was hers, not just by blood, but by right. And together, she and Kaelin would build a future that was worth fighting for. The day of Lyra's formal coronation was upon them. Ridgefall was bustling with activity. Every warrior, advisor, and noble from the surrounding clans gathered in the heart of the fortress for the momentous occasion. There was a weight to the air, a quiet anticipation that filled the great hall as the sun began to dip, casting its golden glow over the stone walls. Lyra stood at the edge of the balcony, looking out over the land she had fought so hard to protect. It had been a long road, one filled with hardship, loss, and sacrifice, but now she was here. Not just as a daughter, not just as a warrior, but as the ruler of the kingdom. The weight of the crown was something she had never truly desired, but now, standing here, she felt its power, its responsibility. The soft rustle of footsteps behind her drew her attention, and she turned to find Kaelin standing in the doorway. He was dressed in the deep green and gold robes of his station, his cloak flowing behind him like a banner of his own strength. His gaze met hers, warm yet unwavering, the golden light of the evening dancing in his eyes. "You're ready," he said simply, his voice filled with quiet confidence. Lyra nodded, but there was a tremor of doubt in her heart. I don't know if I am, Kaelin. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about the entire kingdom. They're looking to me for guidance. What if I fail them? Kaelin stepped closer, his presence a steady anchor amidst the storm of emotions swirling within her. You won't fail them. You've already proven who you are. You've led us through battle, through the darkest of days. You've brought us together when it seemed impossible. There's no one better to lead this kingdom than you. Lyra felt the weight of his words settle over her, and for the first time, the doubt began to melt away. Kaelin had always believed in her, sometimes more than she believed in herself. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Thank you, she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. Kaelin smiled softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. It's time, he said, his voice filled with the certainty that had been missing for so long. The grand hall was filled with a sea of noble faces, each one watching in silence as Lyra made her way down the long aisle. The sound of her boots echoing off the stone floors was the only sound that filled the space. Every step she took felt like the weight of the world on her shoulders, but with each stride she grew more certain. This was her moment. The gathered crowd rose as she approached the dais, the air thick with anticipation. Lord Forlag, the Stoneclaw leader, stood at the head of the hall, flanked by her trusted advisors. The crown, a symbol of her right to rule, lay upon the velvet pillow before them. It gleamed in the light, a golden circle of power and responsibility. Kaelin stood beside her, his presence a constant reassurance. As she reached the dais, he stepped back slightly, allowing her to take her place before the council. Lyra of the Northern Ridge, Lord Forlag's voice rang out, strong and clear. You stand before us today as a leader, a warrior, and now a queen. Do you swear to uphold the laws of the kingdom, to protect its people, and to rule with justice, honor, and strength? Lyra's heart raced as all eyes turned to her. The room was silent, save for the sound of her breath. She could feel the eyes of every clan leader, every warrior, every person in the kingdom upon her. But in that moment, she wasn't just a daughter or a warrior. She was a queen. I swear, she said, her voice firm and steady. I swear to protect this kingdom, to fight for its people, to rule with honor, and to never forget that my duty is to them. This is my oath, and I will keep it. The crowd remained silent for a long moment, but then slowly, one by one, they knelt. It was a gesture of respect, of loyalty, and of unity. The kingdom had accepted her. She was no longer just the warrior queen. They had made her their ruler. Lord Forlag stepped forward, lifting the crown from the pillow and placing it upon her head. The weight of it was more than just metal. It was the weight of history, of legacy, and of the people's hopes. But as the crown settled upon her brow, Lyra felt a strange peace settle in her heart. This was her path, her destiny, and she would walk it with pride. Kaelin stood beside her, his eyes filled with admiration and love. You've done it, he said softly, his voice carrying only to her. You're the queen now. Lyra met his gaze, her heart full. No, she replied, her voice steady. We're the rulers now. Together. The hall erupted into applause, the sound of it echoing through the fortress. Lyra stood tall, her hand resting on the hilt of her sword, the symbol of her warrior spirit. This was her kingdom, and she would defend it with everything she had. Later that evening, as the celebrations began in earnest, Lyra stood with Kaelin in a quiet corner of the hall, watching as the kingdom's people danced and celebrated their new queen. The weight of the day had not yet fully settled on her, but she knew that this was only the beginning. There would be challenges, obstacles, and threats. But there would also be victories, alliances, and hope. Do you think they'll be all right? Lyra asked softly, her voice laced with uncertainty. Kaelin turned to her, his expression tender. They're already better than all right. They have you. She smiled at him, feeling the truth of his words in her heart. And they have you. Together, they watched the kingdom they had fought for. The kingdom they had rebuilt, thriving around them. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, Lyra felt that it was a future worth facing. No longer alone. No longer afraid. Together, they would rule. Together, they would build a legacy that would last. And for the first time, the weight of the crown felt like a promise of a kingdom reborn. The days after Lyra's coronation passed in a blur of ceremonial duties, decisions, and endless correspondence. The kingdom, though united in purpose, was still fragile in many ways. While the people rallied behind her, the political landscape remained tense, filled with old rivalries and secretive alliances. As much as she wanted to focus on rebuilding, Lyra knew there were still many dangers lurking in the shadows. The memory of Duke Valerius's betrayal hung heavy in the air, and while the man himself was gone, his loyalists were still scattered across the kingdom. Their influence was far-reaching, and Lyra knew that eliminating the remnants of his faction would require more than just military might. Kaelin had been by her side throughout it all, offering his wisdom and strength as they navigated the treacherous waters of post-war politics. But even with his unwavering support, Lyra couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was still amiss. There were whispers in the night, rumors of unrest from the farthest corners of the kingdom. Lyra could sense that the peace they had fought so hard to secure was tenuous at best. One evening, after the council had adjourned for the day, Lyra found herself standing by the window of her chambers, staring out into the darkening night. The wind howled through the trees outside, and the air was thick with the scent of rain. She had always loved the stormy nights in the north. There was something raw, something honest about them. But tonight, the storm felt different. It felt like a warning. The soft sound of footsteps behind her broke her thoughts, and she turned to see Kaelin entering the room, his cloak still heavy with the chill of the evening air. "You're up late," he said, his voice a mix of concern and curiosity. Lyra smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I couldn't sleep. There's too much on my mind." Kaelin moved to stand beside her, his presence a comforting anchor as they both looked out over the kingdom. "What's troubling you?" he asked softly, his gaze not leaving the horizon. Lyra sighed, running a hand through her hair as she turned to face him. "I keep thinking about the future. The kingdom is healing, yes, but there are still so many loose threads. The old powers haven't just vanished. Valerius's followers are still out there, waiting for their chance. And there are factions, both within the council and beyond, that I can't fully trust." Kaelin nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed her words. "You're right to be cautious. There will always be those who resist change, especially in times like these. But you've already shown the people that you are capable of leading them through the hardest times. You've earned their respect." "I know," Lyra said, her voice tinged with frustration. "But there's still so much I don't know. So much I haven't figured out. We've defeated the Duke, yes, but that doesn't mean we've defeated his ideas. We need to root out the corruption that runs deep in the kingdom. And we need to ensure that the people trust us. Not just because they have to, but because they believe in what we're building." Kaelin reached out and gently took her hand, his fingers warm against her cold skin. "You're not alone in this, Lyra. I will fight beside you, always. And so will the people who believe in us. Together, we'll face whatever comes." Lyra looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. But still, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the puzzle than she could see. The next morning, Lyra called for a private meeting with her most trusted advisors. They had made great strides in uniting the clans, but Lyra knew the real battle wasn't over yet. It was time to take a more active role in dismantling the factions that still clung to the old ways of thinking. The room was tense as the advisors took their seats, the weight of their collective responsibility heavy in the air. Lyra could feel the anticipation building as she stood at the head of the table, Kaelin at her side. "I've called this meeting," she began, her voice steady, "because it's time we address the lingering shadows that threaten our kingdom. The Duke's supporters are still out there, and we need to find them. They won't just fade into the background. We have to root them out." Her chief strategist, a seasoned warrior named Rylan, leaned forward, his eyes sharp with focus. "You're right, Your Majesty. The remnants of the Duke's faction may be smaller now, but they are no less dangerous. We've already seen signs of unrest in the east and the south. There are rumors of whispers, of underground meetings. The old alliances are still in place." "I've heard the same," Lyra replied, her voice quiet but filled with a determination that set the tone for the room. "We need to strike before they have a chance to regroup. We'll send scouts to the far corners of the kingdom to gather intelligence. And we'll need to strengthen the borders to ensure we don't have any surprises." Kaelin nodded, his gaze fixed on the map of the kingdom laid out before them. "We'll also need to keep the council in line. Some of them are still loyal to the old ways. They may pretend to support us, but loyalty is a fragile thing. We'll have to be vigilant." Lyra took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the faces of her advisors. They were all in agreement. They knew what had to be done. "I've been thinking about how we'll handle the old clans," she said, her voice thoughtful. "The Stoneclaws are with us, but the other clans, there's still too much mistrust. We'll need to forge new alliances, not just with power, but with honesty. We can't afford to let suspicion tear us apart." The room was quiet as the weight of her words settled over them. Lyra had learned over the years that loyalty wasn't something that could be forced. It had to be earned slowly and steadily. And while she had earned the trust of her people, there was still much to be done. The meeting continued late into the night, the plans taking shape. Lyra knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles, but she was ready. She had always been ready. That night, as she lay in her chambers, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The storm was still raging outside, the wind howling against the walls of the fortress. But this time, Lyra didn't fear the storm. She had faced worse, and she knew that whatever came next, she would face it with the strength of the people behind her. Together, they would overcome anything. The kingdom was hers to protect, and she would never let go. The days blurred into one another as the kingdom began to stabilize. The lands once torn by conflict were slowly mending, but Lyra knew that peace was a fragile thing. The whispers of dissent had not fully died, and though the Duke's supporters were scattered, their influence still lingered like a shadow over the kingdom. Lyra had spent countless hours with her advisors, Kaelin at her side, strengthening the alliances she had forged. They worked tirelessly to rebuild trust with the clans, to ensure that the kingdom would not fall prey to division again. But even as the sun rose over the kingdom each day, Lyra's heart remained heavy. There was still a part of her that feared the storm was far from over. It was one such evening, as the fire in the hearth crackled softly, that the first true sign of trouble arrived. A rider from the southern borders arrived at Ridgefall in the dead of night. His face was drawn, his eyes filled with urgency as he handed Lyra a sealed message. The wax was dark red, the seal bearing the symbol of the royal guard. She tore it open with trembling fingers, her heart hammering in her chest. The letter inside was brief, but the message was clear. There had been a disturbance. A faction of the Duke's loyalists had made a move in the southern region, attempting to rally the smaller clans who had yet to pledge loyalty to Lyra. They were recruiting forces, preparing for something, but no one knew what. Lyra's eyes narrowed as she read the letter again. They had been waiting for this, she realized. The silence, the calm after the storm. It had been a mask, hiding the true intentions of those who had never accepted her reign. Kaelin entered the room, his expression unreadable as he saw the letter in her hands. "What does it say?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Lyra looked up at him, her heart sinking. "It's them, the remnants of Valerius's supporters. They're gathering in the south. The clans we've yet to bring fully into our fold are being tempted, promised power, wealth. Everything they think they've lost." Kaelin's face darkened. "And what do they want now?" "They want to take the kingdom back. They're starting with the smaller clans, the ones still loyal to the old ways. And if we don't act fast, we could lose everything." The weight of the situation hit her like a blow to the chest. After everything they had fought for, after the bloodshed, the battles, the sacrifices, this was the price they were paying. The old power structures hadn't just crumbled. They were being rebuilt in the shadows. "We'll need to move quickly," Kaelin said, his voice filled with urgency. "We can't let them gather more strength. We'll have to strike first." Lyra nodded, her resolve hardening. "Gather the council. We'll send out scouts to confirm the location of their forces. Then we strike, swiftly and decisively." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Lyra and Kaelin met with the council, discussing their options and drawing up a plan. They would not repeat the mistakes of the past. The battle for the South would not be a drawn-out war. It would be swift, and it would be decisive. Lyra addressed the warriors, her voice clear and strong, filled with the fire of leadership that had guided her through so many challenges before. "This is not just a fight for land or power," she said, standing before her gathered warriors, her sword at her side. "This is a fight for the future of our kingdom. The peace we've fought for is being threatened, but we will not let the shadows of the past take hold of our future. We will defend our kingdom, and we will fight together." Her words rang out, met with cheers from the warriors who had stood with her through thick and thin. They were ready. Lyra could feel the loyalty in their hearts, the strength in their spirits. She wasn't alone in this, and she wouldn't let anyone else fight alone either. As night fell, the final preparations were made. The warriors gathered their gear, the horses were saddled, and the strategy was set. Lyra and Kaelin would lead the charge, but they would not be alone. The full strength of their army would move with them. They would reclaim the south, and they would put an end to the lingering threat. The march to the southern borders was swift. Lyra rode at the head of the army, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her mind focused on the task ahead. She could hear the sounds of the warriors behind her, the rhythmic beat of hooves, the rustling of armor, the quiet murmur of conversation. The air was thick with anticipation, with the tension of knowing that the battle was near. When they arrived at the border, Lyra and Kaelin took a moment to assess the situation. They had scouted the area, and it was clear that the enemy was not yet fully prepared. Their forces were still scattered, their morale fragile. This was their chance. "We attack at dawn," Kaelin said, his voice low but filled with certainty. "We hit them hard, fast. Take them by surprise." Lyra nodded, her hand tightening around the hilt of her sword. "We fight for the kingdom, for the people." The night passed slowly, the silence between them filled with the weight of what was to come. But as dawn broke, a new sense of clarity settled over her. She was no longer just a daughter of a lord or a warrior queen. She was the queen of this kingdom, and no one would take it from her. Dawn broke, and the battle began. It was over almost before it began. The remnants of the Duke's faction were scattered, their forces outnumbered and unprepared for the full might of Lyra's army. She led the charge herself, her sword cutting through the air with deadly precision. Every swing, every step, was an act of defiance against the past. As the last of the enemy forces fell, Lyra stood at the heart of the battlefield, her breath heavy but her heart lighter than it had been in days. The south was secured. The threat was gone. For now, at least. Kaelin rode up beside her, his eyes filled with pride. "It's done. They won't rise again." Lyra turned to him, her eyes tired but resolute. "Not while we're here. We've won this battle. But the war for the future of this kingdom will continue, and we will face it together." Kaelin nodded, a small, approving smile on his lips. Together. And so they moved forward. Not as a king and queen, not as leaders of rival factions, but as partners bound by a common cause. Together, they would build the future of their kingdom, one victory at a time. The battle had ended, but the work was far from over. Lyra stood at the edge of the camp, watching the soldiers celebrate their hard-won victory. The south had been reclaimed, and with it, a large portion of the kingdom's future stability. But Lyra's mind was already on the next steps. This victory was only temporary if they didn't seize the momentum and make it last. Kaelin was beside her, his eyes scanning the horizon as the last of the wounded were tended to and the banners of victory were raised. The sun was high now, casting its golden light over the battlefield, illuminating the faces of the warriors who had given everything to protect their kingdom. The once barren land, stained with blood and suffering, was now the beginning of something new, a testament to what they could achieve when they fought together. But Lyra couldn't fully celebrate. She knew the road ahead would be filled with even more challenges. There were still those who had been loyal to the Duke, still factions that would plot in the shadows. They had won a battle, but the war for the kingdom's soul was far from over. "I can't help but feel we're just scratching the surface," she said, her voice low as she turned to Kaelin. "The south is secure for now, but there are still pockets of resistance elsewhere. This isn't over." Kaelin's gaze softened as he looked at her. "You're right, but what we've done here today, what we've built, has already changed the kingdom. The people are rallying around you. They're beginning to believe in what we're creating. The old ways are dying, Lyra, and with each victory they die faster." She smiled faintly, but the weight on her shoulders was still there. "I just need to make sure we don't lose sight of what we're building. We're not just fighting to defeat the old powers. We're fighting to create something better, something lasting." Kaelin nodded, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "And that's exactly why we'll win. Because we're not fighting for the throne. We're fighting for the people, for their future." The journey back to Ridgefall was slower than the march to the southern borders, as they carried the wounded and began organizing the prisoners they had taken during the battle. Lyra spent much of the time in silence, contemplating what the next steps would be. The kingdom was healing, but its foundations were still fragile. There were deep divisions among the clans, and it would take more than just military victories to bring them together. They had to prove that the kingdom was worth fighting for, that their future was something worth protecting. When they finally arrived back at Ridgefall, the city was alive with the buzz of recovery. The people had already begun rebuilding, clearing away the remnants of the battle and starting fresh. Lyra couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as she walked through the streets, seeing the determination in the faces of her people. It was the first true sign that the kingdom was not just surviving, it was beginning to thrive. But there was no time for rest. Lyra called for a council meeting the following morning to discuss the next phase of their strategy. It was clear that the South was secure for now, but the larger question remained. How would they unite the kingdom as a whole? The council gathered in the great hall, the atmosphere heavy with the weight of what was at stake. Lyra stood at the head of the table, Kaelin by her side. The advisors, including Rylan, Lord Forlag, and several others, sat in their seats, their faces filled with quiet determination. "We've won the South," Lyra began, her voice steady as she addressed the council. "But the kingdom is still divided. There are clans that have yet to pledge loyalty to us, and there are those who still harbor resentment for what's been lost. We can't just govern by force. We need to show the people that this is their kingdom. They need to feel that they have a place in it." Rylan, the strategist, leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "The question is how. We've already made several alliances, but there are some clans, especially in the northern reaches, that still view you as an outsider. You'll need to prove your legitimacy, not just by strength, but by understanding their needs, their grievances." Lord Forlag nodded in agreement. "He's right. The Stoneclaws have pledged their loyalty, but not all the other clans see you as their rightful ruler. You need to offer them something more than protection. You need to offer them a place in the future of this kingdom, and that won't happen overnight." Lyra felt the weight of their words, but her resolve hardened. She wasn't afraid of hard work. She had faced the impossible before. "I'll go to them," she said, her voice clear. "I'll meet with the northern clans, and I'll listen to their concerns. If they're willing to stand by my side, I'll offer them something that will strengthen the kingdom." Kaelin stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "We'll do this together. We'll show them that the future isn't just about ruling. It's about uniting. And once they see that, they'll know where they belong." Lyra met his gaze, feeling a rush of affection and gratitude. They had come so far together. And together, they would see this kingdom restored to its rightful strength. The days that followed were filled with travel and diplomacy. Lyra and Kaelin set out for the northern clans, riding through the rugged terrain with a small group of trusted warriors. The northern regions were harsh and unforgiving, the land scarred by years of war and neglect. But Lyra knew that this was where her kingdom would truly be tested. If she could win the loyalty of the northern clans, then the kingdom would be hers. Not just by force, but by the will of its people. They arrived in the village of the Ironclaw clan, a place known for its fierce warriors and strong sense of independence. The clan leader, a grizzled old man named Thorn, welcomed them with a wary but respectful attitude. Lyra could feel the weight of his gaze as he sized her up, his eyes sharp and untrusting. "I've heard much about you, Lyra of the Northern Ridge," Thorn said, his voice rough as he stood before her. "But the question remains. What do you want from us? Why should we bend the knee to you?" Lyra stood tall, meeting his gaze with the same intensity. "I don't want you to bend the knee. I want you to stand with me, to fight for the future of this kingdom. Not just for me, but for all of us. We've suffered enough. It's time we built something together." There was a long silence as Thorn studied her, the firelight flickering in his eyes. Finally, he spoke. "You've got the fire of a true leader in you. I'll give you that. But fire alone won't build a kingdom. It takes more than that." Lyra nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. "I know. That's why I'm here. To build something lasting. Something that includes everyone." Thorn's expression softened just a little. "Then we'll talk. But understand this, Lyra. Trust is earned. And it takes more than words." Lyra smiled, her heart lifting at his response. "Then let's begin earning it." The journey through the northern lands had been long, and the weight of the task at hand pressed heavily on Lyra's shoulders. With each clan she visited, the stakes grew higher, the trust harder to earn. But she knew that the unity of the kingdom depended on these last few steps. If she could secure the loyalty of the northern clans, the kingdom would be truly hers. Not just by blood, but by the will of its people. Lyra and Kaelin rode together, the wind biting at their faces as they approached the last of the major northern clans. The journey had taken its toll, but Lyra's resolve had only grown stronger. She had come to understand something vital during this trip. The true strength of the kingdom didn't lie in the hands of one ruler or one army. It lay in the unity of its people, the willingness to fight not for themselves, but for each other. They arrived in the village of the Frostfang clan, known for its stoic warriors and deep-seated traditions. Lyra knew this would be the final test. If the Frostfangs could be convinced to join their cause, then the kingdom would be united. But if they refused, it could mean the end of everything. The leader of the Frostfang clan, a towering woman named Freya, met them at the village gates. Her eyes, a piercing shade of blue, studied Lyra with an intensity that made even the seasoned warriors uneasy. She was a force, one who had earned her place as the clan leader through sheer strength and unyielding will. Lyra of the Northern Ridge. Freya's voice rang out, strong and clear. I've heard much of your deeds, but deeds do not build kingdoms. Alliances do. Tell me, why should the Frostfangs pledge their loyalty to you? What do you offer that we cannot gain on our own? Lyra dismounted from her horse, meeting Freya's gaze with equal strength. I offer unity, not domination. I offer a kingdom where strength is measured not by who can fight the hardest, but by who can lead with wisdom and courage. We've fought too long against each other. The time has come to fight for a future, for something greater than our individual clans. Freya's eyes narrowed, as if considering the weight of Lyra's words. And what makes you think the Frostfangs would trust you? What makes you think your vision aligns with ours? Kaelin stepped forward, his voice calm and steady. Because Freya, you understand the importance of unity. You've held your clan together through countless hardships. You know that in times like these, strength must come from more than just the warriors who fight. It must come from the bonds we forge with those around us. That is why Lyra is here. She's not just asking for your loyalty. She's asking for your trust, because that's the only way we'll all survive. Lyra nodded, her gaze unwavering. Together, we are stronger. We are more than just the sum of our parts. And I know you've seen the division in the kingdom, the unrest, the whispers, the power plays. But we can change that. We can build something new. And that new kingdom needs your strength, your wisdom, and your people. Freya was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. The wind howled around them, but in that moment, the world felt still. Finally, she spoke. I've lost many friends in this war, many allies. I've seen too much betrayal, too much bloodshed to trust easily. But I see something in you, Lyra. I see the same fire that has kept my people alive. I see the same fire that has built this kingdom from the ashes. Lyra held her breath, her heart racing. I will pledge the Frostfangs to you, Freya said at last, her voice heavy with resolve. But know this, you do not rule us. You lead us. There is a difference, and that difference will be tested. Lyra's heart soared with a mixture of relief and pride. You have my word. Together, we will lead this kingdom to a future where no clan stands alone. The news of the Frostfangs' allegiance spread quickly through the northern territories. It was a victory that Lyra had fought for, a victory that would solidify her rule. The last of the major clans had pledged their loyalty to her, and the kingdom was united at last. But even as the celebrations began, Lyra knew that the real work was only just beginning. They had won the hearts and loyalty of the clans. But now, they had to prove that the kingdom they were building was worth fighting for. Weeks passed as Lyra and Kaelin worked tirelessly to ensure the unity they had forged would endure. They organized councils with the clan leaders, spoke with the common folk, and made sure that every person in the kingdom felt as if they had a stake in the future. Lyra had learned the value of listening, of earning the trust of the people, not by commanding them, but by standing beside them. The kingdom began to flourish in ways Lyra had never imagined. The land was being worked once more, the cities slowly rebuilt, and the people, once fractured and divided, were beginning to see themselves as one. One night, as the last of the council meetings for the season came to a close, Lyra and Kaelin stood together in the courtyard of Ridgefall. The stars were out, their light casting a soft glow on the stone walls of the fortress. Kaelin turned to her, his eyes filled with quiet admiration. You've done it, Lyra. You've brought the kingdom together. You've made it strong. Lyra smiled, though the weight of the responsibility still pressed on her heart. We've done it. Together. I couldn't have done any of this without you by my side. He stepped closer, his hand finding hers. And you'll never have to do it alone. In that moment, Lyra realized that the true strength of her kingdom wasn't in the crown she wore, nor in the warriors who fought for her. It was in the people, in the alliances they had forged, in the belief they had in each other. As long as they stood together, no one could tear them apart. Epilogue, a kingdom reborn. The sun rose over the lands of the northern ridge, casting its golden light over the kingdom that Lyra and Kaelin had fought to rebuild. The once barren fields were now alive with crops and livestock. The roads were filled with traders, travelers, and children laughing. The kingdom, once broken and scattered, was now united under one banner. Lyra stood at the head of the great hall, looking out over the people who had become her family, her strength, and her future. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier, but for the first time, it felt like the weight of a promise to the people who had believed in her when no one else had. Kaelin stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "Together," he whispered, his voice full of pride and love. "Together," she agreed, her heart swelling with the knowledge that the future was theirs to build. And as they looked out over the kingdom they had reclaimed, Lyra knew that no matter what challenges came next, they would face them together. Because in the end, it wasn't the power of the throne that mattered. It was the strength of the people, united in purpose and in heart. And that, above all, was what would ensure their future. The end.